They laughed at my thrift shop. Now it's the biggest in the city. Everyone laughed the day I opened my tiny thrift shop. One man stood across the street clapping slowly, while others whispered that the place would close in a month. They saw a broken store, cheap shelves, and a 55-year-old parent starting over with $73. What they did not see was the truth. 3 months earlier, I had lost everything in court. My business, my savings, my reputation, and the person who stole it all thought I would disappear quietly. But what they did next changed everything. They tried to shut down my shop. Then they tried to burn it down. Then they tried to silence the truth forever. And that is when a tiny thrift store turned into the biggest legal fight this city had ever seen. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, the same people who laughed outside my shop were standing in line to get inside. They laughed. Not quietly. Not politely. They laughed the way people laugh when they believe someone has already failed. I still remember the sound. It echoed across the cracked sidewalk while I struggled to lift the metal shutter of a dusty storefront that smelled like old cardboard and forgotten dreams. The sign above the door read, "Second Chance Thrift." The paint was uneven. I painted it myself the night before with a cheap brush and a trembling hand. Someone standing across the street clapped slowly. Another person muttered, "A thrift shop here? That place will close in a month." Then came the laughter again. I stood there at 55 years old, holding a rusted key in my hand, pretending I did not hear them. But I heard every word. Because that little shop was not just a shop. It was the last thing I had left. 3 months earlier, I had been sitting inside a courtroom watching everything I had built over 30 years disappear with a single strike of a judge's gavel. The company, the savings, the house, gone. And the person responsible for it all sat across the courtroom, smiling politely while the lawyers packed their documents. That person used to be my closest friend. But that story comes later. At that moment, all I had was this narrow building with cracked windows, 2 broken lights, and shelves that I built using scrap wood from a construction site. Inside were boxes filled with clothes people donated, old books, and furniture that looked like it survived 3 generations. Nothing inside that shop looked impressive, but to me it looked like survival. I stepped inside and pulled the door closed. Dust floated in the sunlight pouring through the front window. For a moment, the silence felt heavier than the laughter outside. I walked to the counter I built from an old desk and placed the cash box on top. Inside were $73. That was the entire starting budget of the business. People were already mocking. I took a long breath and turned the sign in the window. Open. Nothing happened for the first hour. Then the second hour. Cars drove past without slowing down. A group of teenagers walked by and stared through the glass. One of them laughed and said something I could not hear. They kept walking. By noon, I started wondering if the people outside were right. Maybe opening this shop was a mistake. Maybe starting over at 55 was not courage. Maybe it was desperation. I was about to lock the door early when the bell above the entrance rang for the first time. The sound was small, but it felt like thunder. A woman stepped inside holding the hand of a child. Both looked exhausted. The child stared at a rack of winter jackets. "Are these really $5? The woman asked quietly. I nodded. She looked at me like she did not believe it. Then she walked toward the rack and began searching carefully. The child found a red coat. The sleeves were slightly long, but the smile on that kid's face filled the entire room. When they reached the counter, the woman placed a few coins and a small bill on the desk. "Thank you," she said softly. That moment did something strange. The laughter outside stopped matching, because for the first time that day the shop felt alive. Word spread slowly after that. A college student bought a chair. An elderly man bought a stack of books. A delivery driver bought a winter scarf. Small purchases, small conversations. But something about the shop started attracting people who needed things without paying luxury prices. By the end of the week, I had made $212. Not enough to celebrate, but enough to keep the lights on. That should have been the start of a quiet story about rebuilding a life. But someone powerful had already noticed the shop, and they hated it. 3 weeks after opening, a white envelope appeared under the door before sunrise. No stamp, no return address, just my name written across the front. I opened it standing behind the counter. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Legal letterhead. A law firm from downtown. The message was short. My thrift shop was accused of violating commercial regulations and operating illegally within city zoning limits. If I did not close the shop within 10 days, legal action would begin. I read the letter 3 times. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Because the law firm listed in that letter belonged to the same corporation that destroyed my life months earlier. And the name printed at the bottom of the page belonged to the person who used to sit across the table from me during late-night business meetings. The same person who shook my hand when we built our first company. The same person who smiled inside the courtroom while everything collapsed. They found me again. And this time they wanted the last thing I owned. I stood alone inside that small thrift shop holding the letter while the morning sun slowly crept across the floor. Outside, the same neighbors who laughed at the opening sign walked past the window again. None of them knew the war that was about to begin. But I did, because I recognized the signature at the bottom of the letter. And the message hidden between the lines was clear. They thought I would close the shop quietly. They thought I would disappear. They thought I had nothing left to fight with. What they did not understand, yet, was something very simple. I already lost everything once. And people who have nothing left to lose can become very dangerous opponents. So I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside the cash box, and turned the sign in the window back to open. Because if they wanted another courtroom battle, this time I was ready, and the next move was already coming. They just did not know it yet. 3 months before the thrift shop opened, I sat inside a courtroom that smelled like polished wood and quiet betrayal. The judge had not spoken yet, but I already knew how the story would end, because the person sitting across the room from me avoided my eyes. That person used to call me family. 30 years earlier, we were nothing more than 2 stubborn dreamers standing in an empty storage unit with a borrowed desk and a phone that barely worked. We built our company from nothing. No investors, no wealthy relatives, no safety net, just long nights, cheap coffee, and a promise we repeated to each other again and again. If one of us succeeds, both of us succeed. For decades, that promise held strong. The business grew slowly at the start. We packed orders ourselves, loaded trucks ourselves, swept the floors ourselves. When the first profit arrived, we celebrated with takeout food sitting on cardboard boxes. When the first employee joined, we felt like we owned the world. Years passed. The company grew larger. Offices replaced warehouses. Meetings replaced midnight packing shifts. People began calling us successful. But something changed along the way. Success attracts attention, and attention attracts temptation. At the time, I ignored the warning signs. Late meetings without me. Financial documents arriving late. Lawyers speaking mostly to my partner. I trusted the wrong person for too long. The truth revealed itself on a quiet Monday morning when my partner asked me to sign a set of documents before a meeting. Just routine restructuring, they said casually. I trusted that voice. 30 years of friendship has a way of lowering your guard. So I signed. 3 weeks later, I learned what those papers actually did. Ownership of the company transferred. Not entirely. Just enough to give my partner control. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then the bank accounts froze. Then the lawyers called. Then the board of directors voted. Then the courtroom doors opened. Everything happened so quickly that my mind struggled to keep up. Inside that courtroom, my lawyer whispered quietly, "The paperwork is valid." Those 4 words crushed 30 years of trust. Because valid meant something terrifying. The signatures were real. The documents were legal. And my partner now owned the majority of the company we built together. But the betrayal did not stop there. A week before the trial, I learned something that made the situation even darker. The restructuring plan had been designed months earlier. Every meeting, every document, every quiet decision, all planned, while we still shook hands every morning. The court battle lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of listening to lawyers dissect my life like it was a business case study. Emails presented as evidence. Financial charts displayed on screens. My partner sat calmly at the other table wearing the same friendly expression I had trusted for decades. But the person sitting there was no longer the person I knew. They had become something colder, something patient, something that waited years for the perfect moment to strike. When the final day arrived, the courtroom felt suffocating. The judge reviewed the documents slowly, page after page. Silence filled the room. Then the gavel struck. Ownership of the company officially transferred. My role was terminated. My remaining shares forced into a buyout at a price far below their real value. In a single afternoon, I went from founder to outsider. 30 years of work erased by signatures I trusted too easily. When the courtroom emptied, I remained seated for several minutes, staring at the wooden table. My lawyer placed a hand on my shoulder. "We can appeal," they said quietly. But their voice carried no confidence. Appeals require money. Money I no longer had. Across the room, my former partner spoke to reporters. Their voice carried through the hallway. Difficult decisions sometimes must be made to protect the future of the company. Protect. That word echoed in my mind long after they left the building. Outside the courthouse, the sky was gray and heavy. I sat inside my car without starting the engine. For the first time in decades, I had nowhere to go. The office building no longer belonged to me. The house had already been placed under financial review. Even some of the savings accounts were tangled in legal complications. Everything felt uncertain. Except one thing. The person who betrayed me was not finished. Power changes people. And power mixed with fear creates dangerous decisions. I drove through the city for hours that day. Past familiar streets. Past restaurants where business deals once felt exciting. Past buildings that used to carry my company logo. But the moment that stayed with me the most came late that evening. I parked across the street from the corporate headquarters. The building glowed with expensive lights. Large glass windows reflected the city skyline. And above the entrance hung the company's sign. The same sign I helped design years earlier. Except now my name was no longer attached to it. I watched employees leave the building. Some recognized my car. Some looked away. Then the front doors opened again. My former partner stepped outside, speaking on the phone. They laughed. The sound reached my car, even through the glass. That laughter carried the same tone I heard weeks later when neighbors mocked my thrift shop sign. Confident. Certain that the story had already ended. But something inside me shifted that night. I stopped seeing the loss as an ending. Instead, I began seeing it as something unfinished. Because the truth about betrayal reveals itself slowly. And secrets have a strange habit of returning when people least expect them. 3 months later, I stood inside a tiny thrift shop holding a legal threat from the same corporation that stole everything. The past had followed me. The war had restarted. But this time something felt different. Because while opening that shop, I noticed something strange hidden inside the boxes of donated items. Something small. Something easily overlooked. But something that might change everything. At that moment, I did not fully understand its value. Yet within weeks, that single object would drag my former partner back into a courtroom again. And the next time the judge lifted that gavel, the outcome would not be the same. Because buried inside a forgotten cardboard box in the corner of my thrift shop was a secret connected directly to the company they stole. A secret nobody expected to resurface, including the person who betrayed me. The morning after I received the legal letter, the thrift shop felt different. The same shelves stood against the walls. The same jackets hung on metal racks. The same faint smell of old books floated through the air. Nothing inside the store had changed. Yet the silence felt heavier. I unlocked the door and stepped inside before sunrise, holding the envelope again as if reading it another time might reveal a mistake. The message remained the same. Close the shop within 10 days. Or face legal consequences. There was no greeting. No polite explanation. Just a threat printed in cold black ink. I placed the letter on the counter and stared at it for several minutes. That handwriting at the bottom had already taken everything from me once. But something about this new attack felt strange. Because if a massive corporation truly wanted a small thrift shop gone, they would not start with a warning letter. They would simply crush it, which meant this letter was not the real move. It was the beginning of something else. At 9 in the morning, the bell above the door rang. I expected a customer. Instead, 3 people wearing city inspection badges walked inside. The first man looked around slowly, writing notes on a clipboard. The second person examined the shelves carefully. The third stood near the door watching me. The lead inspector finally spoke. "Are you the owner of this business?" "Yes," I answered. "Name?" I told him. He checked something on his clipboard and nodded. "We received a complaint regarding zoning violations and improper commercial activity." The words sounded rehearsed. Too rehearsed. "What kind of complaint?" I asked. He gestured toward the racks of clothing. "This location is registered under a small retail license. There are questions about whether your operation meets the correct classification." The explanation sounded complicated on purpose, as if confusion was part of the strategy. Customers who entered during the inspection immediately felt uncomfortable. 2 people quietly left without buying anything. The inspectors continued walking through the shop, measuring distances between shelves and checking labels on donated items. The process lasted almost an hour. At the end, the lead inspector placed a small yellow notice on the counter. Temporary review, he said. What does that mean? I asked. It means we will determine whether you can legally continue operating. The words hung in the air like smoke. Legally continue operating. I knew what that really meant. Another courtroom. Another battle. Another chance for the same corporation to erase the last thing I built. The inspectors turned to leave. But as the others walked outside, the third inspector remained behind for a moment. A woman in her 40s. Sharp eyes. Quiet voice. She leaned slightly toward the counter. You should be careful, she said quietly. Why? I asked. She glanced toward the door to make sure the others were outside. Then she lowered her voice further. This complaint did not come from a neighbor. Then who filed it? She hesitated for a second. Corporate legal department. My stomach tightened. Which company? She did not say the name. She did not need to. Instead, she tapped the envelope still lying on the counter. Then she walked out. The bell above the door rang again as she left. I stood alone inside the shop again, staring at the yellow notice. The war had officially begun. But what confused me most was the scale of the attack. A corporation worth millions had sent inspectors to threaten a thrift shop that barely earned enough money to cover electricity. It did not make sense. Unless the shop itself was not the real target. Unless something inside the shop worried them. I looked around slowly. Old jackets. Second-hand furniture. Stacks of books. Nothing looked threatening. Then my eyes landed on the cardboard box sitting in the corner. The same box I noticed the night before. It had arrived 3 days earlier as a donation from a local estate sale. At the time, I barely looked inside. Just another collection of forgotten household items. But something about that box kept pulling my attention back. I walked toward it slowly. The cardboard edges were worn and soft from age. Inside were old papers, photo frames, and several small wooden boxes. At the bottom of the pile sat a thin leather folder. I picked it up carefully. Dust fell from the edges as I opened it. Inside were documents. Not clothing receipts. Not personal letters. Business documents. My heart began beating faster. Because printed across the top of one page was a name I recognized immediately. The name of the company I built 30 years earlier. The same company my former partner now controlled. The document looked old. Older than the court case. Older than the restructuring agreement. I flipped through several pages. Contracts. Financial records. Signatures. And then I saw something that made my hands freeze. A signature that looked almost identical to mine. But the date next to it did not make sense. The document was signed nearly a year before the restructuring papers that destroyed my ownership. Which meant something impossible. Someone had been preparing those legal changes long before the moment I believed the betrayal began. I stared at the paper for a long time. The pieces started connecting slowly. The lawsuit. The zoning complaint. The sudden inspection. The threats. They were not trying to shut down a thrift shop. They were trying to find something. Something they believed might already be here. And somehow, without realizing it, I had already found it. At that moment, the bell above the door rang again. A man entered wearing an expensive suit that looked very out of place in a second-hand store. He did not browse the shelves. He walked straight toward the counter. His eyes briefly scanned the leather folder still in my hands. Then he smiled politely. I represent a private investment group, he said calmly. We are interested in purchasing this building. The offer arrived too quickly. Too precisely. How much? I asked. He slid a piece of paper across the counter. The number written there was far more than the building was worth. For a moment, I understood the trap. They wanted the building. Not the shop. The building. And whatever might be hidden inside it. I folded the offer quietly, then slid the paper back toward him. No, I said. His polite smile faded slightly. Are you sure? It is a generous proposal. Yes, I repeated. He studied my face for a few seconds. Then his eyes moved again toward the folder still resting on the counter. That was when I understood something very dangerous. They already suspected what I had. They just were not certain yet. The man adjusted his jacket and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. Opportunities like this do not appear twice, he said calmly. Then he left. The bell rang again. The shop fell silent. Outside, a black car waited at the curb. The suited man stepped inside it, and the vehicle drove away slowly. I stood there holding the leather folder while my mind raced through the possibilities. Because if the documents inside that folder proved what I suspected, the person who betrayed me did not just steal a company. They committed fraud large enough to destroy everything they built afterward. which meant something else. The next courtroom battle would not be about a small thrift shop anymore. It would be about the truth buried inside those papers. And that truth had the power to collapse an empire. After the man in the expensive suit left, the thrift shop felt smaller. Not physically smaller, but heavier. As if the walls understood something dangerous had just entered the room. I locked the door for a moment and returned to the leather folder. My hands moved slower now. Careful. Every page looked like it belonged inside a corporate archive rather than a cardboard donation box. Contracts. Internal memos. Transfer agreements. The dates kept repeating the same pattern. All of them were created months before the restructuring documents that removed me from my own company, which meant the betrayal had not started when I signed those papers. It had been building quietly long before that moment. A plan carefully constructed while we still shared the same office. But the strange part was not the slow sales. The strange part was the street outside. Cars passed more often than usual. Some slowed down slightly while driving past the window. Two different vehicles stopped across the street for several minutes before leaving. At first I thought it was coincidence. By the afternoon I knew it was not. Someone was watching the shop. The suspicion grew stronger when a delivery truck stopped near the curb around 4 o'clock. The driver walked inside carrying a large box. Package delivery, he said. I frowned. I did not order anything. He checked the label. It is addressed here. I signed for the package anyway. After the driver left, I placed the box on the counter. The cardboard looked new. Inside was something unexpected. 20 winter coats. Brand new. Tag still attached. There was also a note. No name. Just a short message. Someone helped me once when I had nothing. I am passing it forward. I read the message twice. Then I placed the coats carefully on the racks. An hour later, a young father entered with 2 small children. Both kids wore thin jackets that looked far too light for the coming winter. The father hesitated while looking at the new coats. How much are these? He asked. $10, I said. His shoulders relaxed. The children left the store wearing warm jackets and wide smiles. Moments like that kept the shop alive. But while those small victories unfolded, the pressure outside continued building. 2 days later, the inspectors returned. This time they stayed longer. They measured storage areas, photographed the shelves, asked detailed questions about where every donated item came from. The same woman inspector from before approached the counter again near closing time. More complaints arrived, she said quietly. From the same source? I asked. She nodded. They are pushing for a closure order. How long do I have? She hesitated. Possibly a week. 7 days. The same timeline mentioned in the letter. Everything was moving exactly according to someone else's plan. When the inspectors left that evening, I closed the door and locked it carefully. The leather folder returned to the counter. I studied the documents again under the dim light above the desk. One page caught my attention more than the others. A financial transfer agreement. Large sums of money moving through a private account. The signature on the authorization line looked like mine. But I knew I had never signed that document, which meant one thing: forgery. The realization sent a cold wave through my chest. If this document was real, the corporate takeover that destroyed my ownership was built on falsified paperwork. But there was a problem. Proving fraud against a corporation required evidence strong enough to survive an entire legal team. One document alone might not be enough. I turned the page. More transfers. More suspicious signatures. Then I noticed something else. At the bottom of one sheet was a small handwritten note. An address. Not a corporate office. Not a bank. Just a storage facility located on the far side of the city. The date next to the note was 4 years old, which meant something from that time period had been stored there. Something connected to these documents. I leaned back in the chair slowly. The puzzle pieces began moving again inside my head. Someone hid these papers inside a donation box. Someone wanted them to surface. And the corporation, now running my old company, seemed desperate to retrieve them before anyone noticed. The question was simple. Who placed the folder inside that box? And why send it to my thrift shop? The answer arrived sooner than expected. The next morning, I unlocked the shop just after sunrise. A single figure waited outside the door. An elderly man leaning on a wooden cane. His face looked familiar in a distant way, as if I had seen him many years earlier. When he noticed me approaching, he nodded slowly. I was wondering how long it would take you to find the folder, he said. My steps stopped. How do you know about that? The old man smiled slightly. Because I put it there. My heart began beating faster. Why? He studied my face carefully before answering. Because the person who stole your company is not the only one who knows the truth. The morning air felt suddenly colder. Who are you? I asked. He adjusted his coat and stepped closer. My name used to appear on the accounting records of your company, he said quietly. Then he looked directly into my eyes. And the documents in that folder are only the beginning. The words hung between us. Because if he was telling the truth, the story that destroyed my life had hidden layers far deeper than I ever imagined. And the next secret he revealed would explain exactly why a powerful corporation suddenly feared a tiny thrift shop. The old man stood outside the thrift shop like he had been waiting there for hours. His coat looked worn but clean. His grip on the cane was steady. The early morning street remained quiet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Because something about his eyes told me he was not here by accident. You said you put the folder in the donation box, I said. Yes. Why send it here? He studied the shop sign above the door before answering. Because this was the only place they would never think to search. The words sent a quiet chill through me. I unlocked the door and gestured inside. He walked slowly past the racks of jackets and the shelves of books, taking in every corner of the small shop. When he reached the counter, he placed his cane carefully against the desk. You have done something interesting here, he said. It is just a thrift shop. He shook his head slightly. No, it is a problem. For who? For people who built their empire on secrets. I slid the leather folder across the counter. You recognize these documents? He opened it slowly. His fingers moved carefully across the pages as if greeting old memories. I remember preparing some of these reports years ago, he said quietly. You worked for the company? For 15 years. My chest tightened. Then you know what happened. He looked up. I know more than you think. The silence that followed felt heavy, because every answer I wanted had been sitting across from me for several minutes. How did these papers end up here? I asked. He leaned slightly closer. 4 years ago, I discovered irregular financial transfers while reviewing internal accounts. Transfers connected to my partner? He nodded slowly. At the time, I believed they were minor accounting adjustments. But the numbers kept repeating. He tapped one page inside the folder. Money leaving the company and moving through private accounts. I felt anger building inside my chest again. That was the beginning of the fraud. Yes, he said, but the scale was larger than you realize. I stared at him. What do you mean? He flipped to another page and pointed at a series of numbers. These transactions funded several shell companies. Shell companies. The phrase echoed inside my head. They used those companies to purchase assets connected to the business, he continued. Which means the corporation that replaced your company was built using money stolen from the original one. The realization hit me like cold water. The theft had not simply taken control of the company. It had rebuilt the entire structure using hidden funds. How long did you know about this? I asked. Years. Then why stay silent? The old man did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder slowly. Because speaking against powerful people requires protection. And you did not have it. No. He looked toward the front window where the morning sunlight began spreading across the floor. But something changed recently. What? They started cleaning the records. The words made my stomach tighten. Cleaning. Destroying. Anything connected to the early transfers. That explained everything. The inspection. The legal threats. The offer to buy the building. They were searching for missing evidence. Evidence that had already escaped their control. How did you get these documents out? I asked. The old man gave a quiet smile. I was the accountant. Of course. Access to records meant access to secrets. And the storage address written on one of the pages? I asked. He nodded again. That facility still holds several boxes. My pulse quickened. More documents? Yes. Enough to prove everything? He paused before answering. Enough to start a war. The phrase lingered in the air. Because that was exactly what this situation had become. A legal war. One that would pull both sides back into the courtroom again. But the difference this time was simple. I might finally have evidence. Outside the shop, a dark sedan passed slowly along the street. Both of us noticed it. The old man lowered his voice. They already know the folder is missing. How? I worked inside their system long enough to recognize patterns. He pointed toward the window. People like them do not send inspectors and lawyers for small problems. The car continued down the road and disappeared around the corner. My mind raced through the possibilities. if the documents inside the storage facility matched the ones in the folder. The corporation that destroyed my life could collapse overnight. But retrieving those boxes would not be easy. Where is the facility? I asked. Industrial district near the river. Is the unit still under your name? Yes. That means we can access it. He shook his head. Not safely. Why? Because someone has already tried. A chill ran through me. What happened? 2 nights ago, someone broke into the storage office asking questions about old rental units. The puzzle pieces moved again. They are searching for the same evidence. Yes. I leaned against the counter thinking carefully. So the moment we visit that storage unit, they will know. Very likely. The old man studied my expression. You should walk away, he said quietly. This situation is larger than you think. I almost laughed at the irony. Walk away. Yes. I shook my head slowly. I already walked away once. The courtroom, the company, the house, everything. But walking away again would mean accepting the lie that destroyed my life. And that was something I could not do anymore. If those boxes prove the truth, I said, then they belong in front of a judge. The old man remained silent for several seconds. Then he nodded. I hoped you would say that. Why? Because I cannot fight them alone. Outside, the street grew busier as the city began waking up. Customers would arrive soon. But my attention remained fixed on the storage address written on that document. Because somewhere across the city sat boxes filled with the truth. Truth powerful enough to shake an entire corporation. But retrieving it would place both of us directly in the path of the people who stole everything. The old man picked up his cane. When do we go? He asked. I checked the clock on the wall. 8:20 in the morning. Plenty of daylight. Plenty of witnesses. But daylight also meant something else. More eyes. More chances for someone to notice. I folded the storage address and placed it in my pocket. Tonight, I said. The old man nodded slowly. Then he walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. There is something else you should know, he said. What? The person who betrayed you does not just control a company now. I waited. They control several judges, investors, and politicians. The weight of those words settled heavily. Because exposing fraud at that level would not simply trigger a lawsuit. It would expose a network of power. And people with that much power rarely lose quietly. The bell above the door rang as he stepped outside. I stood alone again in the small thrift shop. The racks of second-hand clothes looked exactly the same as before. But the story surrounding this place had already grown much larger. Because tonight we would open a storage unit that someone desperately wanted to keep buried. And whatever waited inside those boxes had the power to start the most dangerous chapter of this entire fight. The rest of that day moved slowly. Every minute felt heavier than the last. Customers came and went like any other day. A college student bought a lamp. An older couple argued quietly over a bookshelf. A teenager spent 10 minutes deciding between 2 jackets that both cost less than lunch. From the outside, the thrift shop looked like a simple store trying to survive. But inside my head, something much bigger was unfolding. Because once the sun set, I would walk into a storage facility that might contain enough evidence to destroy the person who stole everything from me, or enough danger to bury the truth forever. Around 6 in the evening, the old accountant returned. This time he wore a darker coat and carried a small flashlight inside his pocket. Did anyone suspicious come by today? He asked quietly. 2 cars slowed down near the shop. Nothing else. He nodded. That means they are still watching. The words did not surprise me. A corporation does not send inspectors, lawyers, and offers to buy buildings without keeping an eye on the target. We waited until the street grew quieter. 9:30. Most nearby businesses had already closed. At 10:15, I turned the shop sign to closed. The old man and I stepped outside together. The night air felt colder than usual. My car sat parked beside the curb. The accountant moved slowly, but his eyes remained alert. Drive normally, he said as he entered the passenger seat. Normal is difficult tonight. Then pretend. The engine started. The small thrift shop disappeared behind us as we drove toward the industrial side of the city. Streetlights passed overhead one after another. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. Both of us understood the same thing. If anyone followed us, the plan would collapse. 20 minutes later, the buildings around us changed. Restaurants and apartments gave way to warehouses and storage lots. The storage facility stood near the river behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Rows of metal units stretched into the darkness. A single security light flickered above the office. I parked near the entrance gate. The accountant studied the surrounding street carefully. "No cars behind us," he said. "Good." He removed a small key ring from his coat. "That unit has been rented under my name for years." Nobody ever asked questions. We walked through the gate and into the narrow rows of storage units. Each door looked identical. Cold metal, small locks, faded numbers painted above them. The accountant stopped in front of unit 417. "This one," he said. For a moment, neither of us moved, because opening that door might change everything. He unlocked the padlock slowly. The metal door rolled upward with a harsh scraping sound that echoed through the quiet rows. Inside sat 6 cardboard boxes stacked neatly against the back wall. Dust covered the tops, but the boxes looked untouched, at least from a distance. I stepped closer and opened the first one. Inside were financial ledgers, original copies, bank transfer records. The accountant leaned over my shoulder. "These are the early transaction books," he said quietly, "before the restructuring." I flipped through several pages. The numbers matched the suspicious documents from the leather folder. Transfers moving through private accounts. Money redirected into shell companies. Every page strengthened the same conclusion. Fraud. Massive fraud. The second box contained internal emails printed on company letterhead. The third held contracts between the shell companies and corporate suppliers. Each document connected another piece of the puzzle. My former partner had not simply taken control of the company. They had drained it, then rebuilt their empire using stolen funds. The accountant opened the fourth box. His eyes widened. "These are the original shareholder agreements." "Meaning?" "These prove you never approved the restructuring." My pulse quickened. That single document could tear apart the legal case that removed me from ownership. But as we studied the papers, a sound cut through the night. A car door closing. Both of us froze. The storage facility had been silent for 20 minutes. Now footsteps echoed somewhere near the entrance. The accountant whispered quickly. They followed us. My heart began racing. How? I do not know. The footsteps grew louder. More than one person. I closed the box quickly. "What do we do?" The old man grabbed one of the boxes and pushed it toward me. "Take the most valuable documents." "What about the rest?" "They may already know what is here." Another car door slammed outside the facility. Voices followed. Men. At least 3. Flashlights flickered between the rows of storage units. My mind raced. If they found us here with these boxes, the evidence could disappear before it ever reached a courtroom. "Quickly," the accountant whispered. I filled my arms with the most critical files. Contracts. Ledgers. The shareholder agreement. Then we pulled the storage door halfway down. Footsteps approached closer. Flashlight beams passed across nearby units. One voice spoke loudly. "Check every row." The command sounded cold and confident. The accountant looked at me. "Take the documents to your car." "What about you?" "I will slow them down. You cannot face 3 men alone." He smiled faintly. "I spent 15 years surviving corporate politics. 3 men with flashlights do not scare me." The voices grew closer. Flashlight beams bounced off the metal doors around us. "There," one man said suddenly. "They opened this unit." The accountant grabbed the storage door and slammed it shut. The loud metal crash echoed through the entire facility. Then he whispered urgently, "Run." I did not hesitate. The documents pressed tightly against my chest as I moved quickly between the rows of units. Behind me, voices erupted. "Someone is here." Footsteps pounded against the pavement. Flashlights swung wildly through the darkness. The facility gate came into view ahead. My car waited just beyond it. I reached the vehicle, opened the trunk, and threw the documents inside. But when I looked back toward the storage rows, I saw something that stopped me cold. 2 men were chasing the accountant, and a third man stood beside the storage unit holding a phone, watching everything. Even from a distance, I recognized the calm posture, the expensive coat, the same confident stillness I remembered from years earlier. Because the person standing there was not just an employee sent to retrieve documents. It was the person who betrayed me. My former partner had come personally, and they were smiling. The moment I saw that smile, every memory from the courtroom came rushing back. The polished table, the confident lawyers, the quiet voice explaining why I no longer owned the company I built. And now that same person stood beside the storage unit in the middle of a dark industrial lot, as if this entire situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. My former partner slowly stepped forward while the two men chasing the accountant grabbed him near the end of the row. The old man struggled but could not escape their grip. I stood beside my car holding the open trunk, my mind racing. If I drove away now, I could save the documents. But leaving the accountant behind would mean abandoning the only witness who understood the records inside those boxes. My former partner raised a hand calmly. "Bring him here." The two men forced the accountant toward the open space between the rows of storage units. Their flashlights created long shadows across the pavement. Then my former partner turned their eyes toward me. "So you found the documents," they said. The voice sounded exactly the same as it did years ago. Smooth, controlled, as if this entire confrontation had already been calculated. "You followed us," I replied. "Of course." They gestured toward the storage unit. "I wondered how long it would take you to discover that folder." That statement made my stomach tighten. "You knew about it." I suspected someone had taken copies of certain records years ago. Their gaze moved toward the accountant. "And now I see who." The old man tried to pull his arm free. "You stole everything," he said angrily. My former partner sighed quietly. "Stole is such a dramatic word. You forged signatures. That is a legal opinion." The calm arrogance in their voice felt almost unreal, as if the evidence sitting inside my trunk meant nothing. "You ruined lives," the accountant said. "And yet here we are," my former partner replied. They turned back toward me. "You should have accepted the offer for the building." So this was never about zoning laws. Of course not. They stepped closer, hands inside the pockets of an expensive coat. It was about controlling the situation before you realized what those documents contained. I glanced toward the storage unit. "You knew they were here." "Yes." "Then why not retrieve them earlier?" A faint smile appeared again. "Because I did not know exactly where they were hidden." Their eyes moved briefly toward the accountant. "But now that problem has been solved." One of the men holding the accountant tightened his grip. The old man winced. My former partner spoke again. "Hand over the documents." "No," I said. Their expression did not change. "You cannot win this fight. You already said that once." And I was correct. They gestured toward the surrounding darkness. "Do you think anyone will believe a thrift shop owner accusing a successful corporation of fraud?" I leaned slightly against the car. "They might if a courtroom sees the original documents." Their smile faded slightly. "That will not happen." The air between us felt tense and electric. My former partner stepped even closer. "Give me the files," they said quietly, "or this situation becomes unpleasant." Behind them, the two men pushed the accountant forward again. He nearly fell. My anger rose instantly. "You are threatening a 70-year-old man," I said. "I am protecting a business." "No," I replied slowly. "You are protecting a lie." For a moment, silence filled the storage yard. Then my former partner laughed softly. "You always had a dramatic way of looking at things." They nodded toward one of the men. "Search the car." The man began walking toward the trunk. My mind moved quickly. If they retrieved the documents now, everything we risked tonight would disappear. But something about my former partner's confidence suddenly made sense. They believed the situation was already under control, which meant they had not noticed something very simple. The trunk was empty, because while they focused on the confrontation, I had already slid the most critical documents beneath the passenger seat. The man reached the trunk and looked inside. "Nothing here," he said. My former partner's expression shifted slightly. "That is impossible." I crossed my arms. "You are looking in the wrong place." The moment stretched painfully. They studied my face carefully. Then their eyes moved slowly toward the car doors. Understanding flashed across their expression. "Search the vehicle," they ordered sharply. Both men moved toward the car. But before they could reach it, a sudden noise cut through the night. Police sirens. Distant at first, then growing louder. Red and blue lights appeared at the far end of the street outside the facility. My former partner turned instantly toward the sound. "What did you do?" they asked. I gave a small shrug. "When someone threatens witnesses and chases people through storage facilities at midnight, it tends to attract attention." The truth was slightly different. While they were focused on the accountant earlier, I had quietly pressed the emergency call button on my phone. Not to report fraud, just to report suspicious activity. The sirens grew louder. My former partner's calm expression finally cracked. The two men stepped back from the car. "What now?" one of them asked nervously. My former partner looked at me with cold anger. This is not over. I know, I replied. The police vehicles turned into the storage entrance. Lights flooded the rows of metal doors. Several officers stepped out quickly. What is going on here? One officer shouted. My former partner adjusted their coat immediately. The calm businessperson returned. We were simply retrieving personal property from a rented unit, they said smoothly. The officer looked at the accountant's restrained arms. That does not look simple. The two men released their grip quickly. The accountant stepped beside me. One officer approached us. Anyone injured? No, I said. The officer glanced between everyone present. This place received a report about suspicious activity. I nodded slightly. I made that call. My former partner looked at me again with quiet fury. But they said nothing. Because with police officers standing only a few feet away, their control over the situation had vanished. The officer spoke again. We will need identification from everyone. My former partner reached for their wallet. As they handed the identification card to the officer, they leaned slightly closer to me. Their voice dropped to a whisper. You may think tonight helped you. I did not respond. But courtrooms are complicated places, they continued quietly. And by the time this reaches a judge, you may regret starting this war. The officer returned their identification a moment later. Everything appears in order, he said. But I recommend everyone goes home. My former partner nodded politely. They walked toward their car with the two men following closely. Before entering the vehicle, they looked back at me one final time. No smile this time. Only cold calculation. Then the car disappeared into the darkness. The police vehicles left soon after. The storage yard returned to silence. The accountant leaned heavily against his cane. That was close, he said. Yes. I reached inside the car and retrieved the documents from beneath the seat. The old man looked at the stack of papers. With those records, he said slowly, we can reopen the case. I nodded. Yes. The night air felt colder again, because now the next battle would not happen in a storage yard. It would happen inside a courtroom. And the person who stole my life had already promised one thing. They would not lose quietly. The morning after the storage facility confrontation, the thrift shop opened like any other day. Sunlight entered through the front window. Dust floated quietly in the air. A rack of donated jackets leaned slightly to one side because one of the legs had broken the week before. From the outside, nothing about the shop looked powerful. But inside my bag sat documents that could shake an entire corporation. The accountant arrived shortly after opening. He placed a thick envelope on the counter. What is that? I asked. A lawyer. I raised an eyebrow. That envelope does not look like a lawyer. It is the name of one. He slid a business card across the desk. The name printed on it belonged to someone I recognized immediately. A litigation attorney known for handling complex financial fraud cases. You think they will take this case? I asked. The accountant nodded slowly. If the documents say what I believe they say, they will not just take the case. What then? They will chase it. That afternoon, we drove across the city to a tall office building with mirrored windows. The lawyer met us in a quiet conference room. Their eyes moved carefully across every document we placed on the table. The ledgers, the contracts, the shareholder agreement. Each page received the same careful attention. Almost an hour passed before the lawyer finally leaned back in the chair. This is not a small case, they said calmly. I know. This is corporate fraud. The accountant spoke quietly. For years, the lawyer tapped the shareholder agreement. This document alone raises serious questions about the legality of the ownership transfer. I felt a small spark of hope. So we can challenge it. Yes. The lawyer closed the folder slowly. But understand something. What? The company you are accusing has a legal team large enough to fill this entire floor. I already knew that. They will try to bury this case. The lawyer continued. Delay it. Discredit witnesses. Destroy reputations. I looked at the documents again. They already tried. The lawyer studied me for a moment, then nodded. Then I will represent you. The words landed quietly but powerfully. Why? I asked. The lawyer's answer came without hesitation. Because if these documents are authentic, someone built a corporate empire on fraud. The lawsuit was filed 2 days later. The reaction was immediate. News outlets across the city began reporting on the case. The headlines spread quickly. Former founder accuses major corporation of financial manipulation. At first, the story appeared on small legal blogs. Then local newspapers picked it up. Then television stations. Within a week, reporters stood outside the thrift shop asking questions. Cameras pointed toward the same storefront that people laughed at only weeks earlier. Customers continued entering the shop while reporters waited outside. The irony felt strange. A tiny thrift store had suddenly become the center of a massive legal battle. But the corporation did not remain silent for long. 5 days after the lawsuit was filed, their response arrived. A counter-lawsuit, defamation, business interference, financial damages. Their lawyers claimed I fabricated the documents in order to destroy the reputation of a successful company. The attack came exactly as the lawyer predicted. Aggressive, strategic, relentless. The first courtroom hearing took place 3 weeks later. Walking into that building felt painfully familiar. The same marble floors, the same quiet hallways, the same heavy doors leading into rooms where lives could change in minutes. But this time something felt different. Because this time I was not walking in alone. The accountant sat beside me. The lawyer carried a briefcase filled with evidence. And the courtroom itself looked larger than I remembered. Reporters filled several rows behind us. Across the room sat my former partner, surrounded by lawyers. Their expression remained calm, almost bored, as if this entire situation was nothing more than an inconvenience. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. My lawyer spoke first. Calm, direct, explaining the evidence of financial transfers and falsified agreements. The documents were displayed on large screens. Each page examined carefully. The courtroom remained silent. Then the opposing lawyers stood. Their voice carried sharp confidence. These accusations are nothing more than a desperate attempt by a failed business owner to damage a successful corporation. The words stung, but I expected them. They continued speaking, claiming the documents were incomplete, questioning the credibility of the accountant, suggesting the entire case was built on personal revenge. Then they introduced something unexpected, a stack of financial reports. These records, the lawyers said, prove that the company operated legally during the period in question. The judge studied the papers. My lawyer examined them carefully. For several minutes, the courtroom filled with quiet discussion between the legal teams. Finally, the judge spoke. This court will require a full forensic accounting review of the financial history presented here. That decision changed everything. Because forensic audits do not rely on arguments. They rely on numbers. Numbers do not lie easily. My former partner watched the discussion quietly, but I noticed something small. For the first time since this case began, their expression tightened slightly. Because a forensic investigation meant digging deeper. Much deeper. The hearing ended shortly after. As people left the courtroom, reporters rushed toward us. Do you believe you can win this case? What will happen if the fraud allegations are proven? Was the company stolen from you? My lawyer stepped between the cameras and us. No statements today. We moved through the hallway quickly. But just before reaching the exit doors, I heard footsteps behind me. My former partner approached slowly. Their lawyers remained several steps back. For a moment, we stood face to face again. You have caused quite a spectacle, they said quietly. I am just telling the truth. Their eyes narrowed slightly. You believe those papers will save you. They might. They leaned closer. You forget something. What? Courts move slowly. I said nothing. And while they moved slowly, they continued. Business continues moving quickly. The meaning of those words became clear 2 days later. When I returned to the thrift shop that morning, a large notice hung on the front door. City Property Department. Building Safety Review. Temporary Closure Order. My heart sank. Inside the envelope attached to the notice was a short explanation. Structural concerns. Inspection required. Business operations suspended until further notice. Across the street, several people stood watching the scene. One of them held a phone, recording. I knew immediately what had happened. The courtroom battle had begun, and my former partner had just made the first move outside the courtroom. They could not stop the lawsuit, but they could try to destroy the thrift shop. The same shop people once laughed at. The same shop that had become my only source of income. The same shop that now stood closed behind a yellow warning sign. And somewhere across the city, the person responsible was probably smiling again. But what they did not realize yet was something very simple. Shutting down the shop would not stop the case. In fact, it might do the exact opposite. Because people were already paying attention. And once the public starts watching a legal battle, secrets become much harder to hide. The yellow closure notice on the thrift shop door stayed there for exactly 1 hour before someone took a picture of it. By noon, that picture was everywhere. Local news websites posted the image beside headlines about the lawsuit. Reporters returned to the street. Cameras pointed at the locked door, while microphones captured every small detail. And something unexpected happened. People began asking questions. Not about the lawsuit. About the shop. Because during the few weeks it had been open, the thrift shop had quietly helped dozens of people in the neighborhood. Parents who needed cheap clothes for their children. Workers who needed jackets for cold mornings. Students who needed furniture for tiny apartments. Those people remembered. By mid-afternoon, a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk outside the closed store. Some stood quietly. Some spoke to reporters. A woman holding a red winter coat told a television camera, "This shop helped my son when we had nothing." Another man held up a pair of worn work boots. "I bought these here for $5. That place closing does not make sense." Inside my car across the street, I watched everything unfold. The accountant sat beside me. "This was not part of their plan," he said quietly. "No," I replied, "because the closure notice was supposed to end the story. A quiet bureaucratic shutdown. Just another small business disappearing without explanation." But the lawsuit had already drawn attention. And attention has a strange habit of spreading. A reporter approached my car when they noticed me watching the shop. "Are you the owner?" she asked. "Yes." "Do you believe the closure is related to the lawsuit?" I chose my words carefully. "The city says it is about structural inspection." "And what do you think?" I looked at the yellow notice hanging on the door. "I think people can decide that for themselves." The interview lasted less than 2 minutes. But that evening, the clip appeared on every local news broadcast. The story shifted. It was no longer about a small thrift shop closing. Now it was about a legal fight between a former founder and a powerful corporation. And the public loved the story. Because people enjoy watching powerful figures face questions. The next morning, something even stranger happened. Customers began leaving donations outside the locked door. Boxes of clothes. Small pieces of furniture. Books. Someone taped a note to one of the boxes. "Open again soon." By the afternoon, there were so many items stacked against the wall that the sidewalk became difficult to pass. The accountant shook his head while looking at the growing pile. "They are turning your shop into a symbol." I did not ask for that. Symbols rarely ask. But the growing attention created pressure. And pressure forced reactions. 3 days after the closure, the city inspection team returned. This time with reporters watching. They entered the building, examined the foundation, checked the walls, studied the ceiling beams. The process lasted nearly 2 hours. When the inspectors finally stepped outside again, one of them spoke briefly to the cameras. "The building is structurally sound." The crowd on the sidewalk began murmuring. Someone clapped. The inspector continued speaking. "Minor repairs are recommended, but there is no safety risk that would justify closing the business." The yellow closure notice was removed minutes later. The door reopened. The same door that had once opened to silence now opened to something entirely different. People rushed inside. Not dozens. Hundreds. The shop filled faster than I could process. Customers searched through racks. Volunteers helped organize donations. Someone brought coffee for everyone working behind the counter. The small thrift shop that once struggled to attract a single visitor had suddenly become the busiest place in the neighborhood. But the surge of support came with something else. Visibility. And visibility attracts enemies. 2 nights later, I closed the shop just after 10. The crowd had finally disappeared. The shelves looked half empty because so many items had been purchased. I locked the door and stepped outside. The street felt quiet again. But the silence did not last long. A sudden crashing sound exploded behind me. Glass shattered. I turned instantly. Flames flickered inside the front window. Someone had thrown something through the glass. Fire spread quickly across a pile of donated clothes near the display rack. My heart jumped into my throat. I rushed back inside. Smoke filled the room. The flames climbed quickly up the fabric pile. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from behind the counter. The spray blasted across the burning clothes. White foam covered the flames. For several tense seconds, the fire fought back. Then it slowly died. The room fell quiet again, except for the sound of smoke alarms screaming above my head. I stepped outside coughing. Neighbors rushed toward the building. Someone called the fire department. Within minutes, flashing lights filled the street again. Firefighters entered the shop to check for hidden flames. One of them walked back outside shaking his head. You were lucky, he said. What caused it? He pointed toward the broken window. Molotov cocktail. The words landed heavily. This was not an accident. Someone wanted the shop gone. Not through paperwork this time. Through fire. A police officer began asking questions. Did you see anyone nearby before the incident? No. Any recent disputes? I hesitated. Then I answered honestly. I am currently involved in a lawsuit. The officer wrote something in his notebook. We will investigate. But I already understood something simple. This was not random. Someone felt pressure. The lawsuit. The public attention. The reopening of the shop. Every development pushed the corporation closer to a corner. And desperate people make dangerous choices. Later that night, I stood inside the shop again. The broken window had been temporarily covered with plywood. The burned clothes sat inside a black trash bag near the door. The smell of smoke still lingered. The accountant stood beside me quietly. They are afraid, he said. Yes. And fear leads to mistakes. I looked around the small store. The same place people once laughed at. Now someone had tried to burn it down. Because it had become something much bigger than a secondhand shop. It had become the center of a story spreading across the entire city. And somewhere out there, the person responsible for the fire believed they were protecting their empire. But what they did not realize was something very dangerous. Every desperate move they made created more witnesses, more evidence, more attention, and in a courtroom full of reporters and investigators, attention can become the most powerful weapon of all. 2 weeks after the fire, the courtroom filled faster than anyone expected. Reporters arrived early. Television cameras waited outside the building. Even people with no connection to the case filled the public seating rows. The lawsuit had grown into something the entire city wanted to witness. Inside the courtroom, the air felt tense. My lawyer placed several folders on the table. Across the room, my former partner sat with a team of attorneys larger than before. Their confidence had returned. But something about their posture looked tighter, more careful. Because during the previous 2 weeks, the forensic accounting team appointed by the court had completed its first report. And numbers have a way of speaking loudly. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The room fell silent as the hearing began. My lawyer stood first. Their voice remained steady. Your Honor, the financial investigation requested by this court has produced findings directly related to the ownership transfer that occurred 3 years ago. The judge nodded. Proceed. Large screens beside the judge displayed the forensic report. Charts appeared. Lines of financial movement. Dates. Transfers. The courtroom remained completely silent. The forensic auditor stepped forward to explain the findings. We examined internal financial records, bank transfers, and corporate agreements from the period before the restructuring. The auditor clicked to the next slide. Several accounts appeared connected by lines. These accounts moved large amounts of money through private companies not disclosed to shareholders. My former partner's lawyers shifted in their seats. The auditor continued. Those funds were later used to purchase assets connected to the corporation currently under dispute. My lawyer stepped closer to the screen. Can you explain the significance of that finding? Yes, the auditor said calmly. It suggests that corporate funds were redirected before the ownership restructuring occurred. The judge leaned forward slightly. Redirected by whom? The auditor hesitated briefly, then pointed to a name displayed on the screen. The name of my former partner. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. The opposing lawyer stood immediately. Objection. These conclusions are speculative. The judge raised a hand. The witness is presenting financial analysis requested by this court. The objection is noted but overruled. The auditor continued. There is additional evidence regarding signatures on several authorization documents. The screen changed again. 2 signatures appeared side by side. One authentic, one forged. Based on handwriting analysis and document comparison, the auditor explained, these signatures were not written by the same person. My lawyer turned toward the judge. These signatures appear on the transfer authorization used to restructure ownership of the company. The judge studied the screen carefully. Across the room, my former partner finally spoke. This is ridiculous. Their voice sounded sharper than before. Those documents were reviewed by multiple legal teams at the time. The auditor remained calm. Our analysis focuses on the documents themselves. The opposing lawyer quickly approached the judge. We request additional time to review these claims. My lawyer responded immediately. The evidence has already been available to the defense for review. The judge raised a hand again. Order. The courtroom fell silent. The judge looked at my former partner directly. Do you wish to address these findings? For the first time since the lawsuit began, hesitation appeared in their expression. Then they stood. These accusations are built on incomplete information, they said firmly. Our company followed legal procedures during the restructuring. My lawyer stepped forward. Then perhaps you can explain the existence of several shell companies that received corporate funds months before the ownership transfer. The screen displayed the list of companies. One by one, the courtroom remained silent, because every name connected back to the same private account, an account controlled by my former partner. The judge spoke again. Do you deny controlling these accounts? My former partner looked toward their legal team. No one spoke. The judge repeated the question. Do you deny it? A long pause followed. Finally, my former partner answered. No, a murmur spread across the room. The admission felt like the first crack in a massive wall. My lawyer continued carefully. And those accounts received funds from the original company before the restructuring. Yes. And those funds were later used to purchase assets connected to the new corporation. Silence. The judge watched closely. Answer the question. My former partner's voice came quietly this time. Yes. The courtroom erupted with whispers, because the story that once sounded like an accusation now looked like a confession. My lawyer took one final step forward. Then the restructuring that removed my client from ownership was built on financial transfers that were never disclosed to shareholders. The judge looked back at the forensic auditor. Is that conclusion supported by the evidence? Yes. The judge sat back in the chair. For several seconds, the courtroom remained completely silent. Then the judge spoke words that changed everything. This court finds sufficient evidence to question the legality of the ownership transfer. Across the room, my former partners. Lawyers began whispering urgently, but the judge continued. The restructuring agreement will be suspended pending further investigation. The words echoed across the room. Suspended. That single word carried enormous consequences. Because suspending the agreement meant the ownership structure of the company would return to its original form until the investigation finished, which meant something no one in that room expected. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered quietly, "You are temporarily reinstated as a shareholder." My breath caught. Across the courtroom, my former partner's calm expression finally shattered. They stood suddenly. This is unacceptable. The judge looked directly at them. This is the consequence of the evidence presented today. Security officers stepped slightly closer to the defense table as the tension grew. My former partner slowly sat down again, but the anger in their eyes remained. The hearing ended shortly after. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed toward us again. Did the judge just restore your ownership? What does this mean for the company? My lawyer answered carefully. The investigation continues. But the truth was already clear. The empire that replaced the company I built had just suffered a massive crack. And cracks tend to spread. Later that evening, I returned to the thrift shop. The same small store where people once laughed. The same place someone tried to burn down. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The shelves looked messy from the busy day. Donations covered half the floor again. The accountant stood near the counter. Well, he asked. The judge suspended the ownership transfer. He smiled slowly. Then the truth is finally moving. Yes. But the war was not finished. Because while the courtroom decision weakened the corporation, it did not destroy it. Powerful people rarely accept defeat quietly. And somewhere out there, the person who betrayed me was already planning their next move. But now the situation had changed. Because the next hearing would not just question financial transfers. It would determine who actually owned the company. And when that day arrived, one thing would finally become clear. Who built the empire? And who stole it? The morning after the courtroom decision felt unreal. For weeks, the thrift shop had survived on determination, cheap shelves, and a few loyal customers. Now people lined up outside before the door even opened. I stood across the street for a moment, watching the line stretch along the sidewalk. Some people held bags of clothes to donate. Some carried small furniture pieces. Others simply waited to shop. The same neighbors who once laughed at the sign now spoke about the shop like it was part of the community. The accountant stood beside me. You should probably open the door, he said quietly. Yes. But I stayed there another few seconds. Because the scene felt almost impossible to process. A month earlier, the shop struggled to attract anyone. Now it looked like the busiest place on the block. I crossed the street and unlocked the door. The bell rang, and the line began moving. Customers filled the shop within minutes. Someone placed a stack of donated books near the counter. Another person carried in 2 chairs. A college student offered to help organize clothing racks. The store became louder and more alive than ever before. But the attention did not stop with customers. Reporters still appeared regularly. Television cameras occasionally filmed the activity inside the store. The story had grown beyond a simple lawsuit. People saw the thrift shop as proof that someone could lose everything and still stand up again. And that story spread fast. 2 weeks after the courtroom decision, something unexpected happened. A local warehouse owner walked into the shop late one afternoon. He looked around quietly for several minutes. Then he approached the counter. "You are running out of space," he said. I looked at the crowded shelves. "That is true. I own a storage warehouse near the train yard," he continued. "It has been empty for years. I waited. You can use it." "For what?" "To expand this place." The idea sounded enormous. "I cannot afford a warehouse," I said. "You do not need to." "Why?" He shrugged slightly. "Because this shop helped my sister when she had nothing." The same story repeated again. Someone helped. Someone remembered. And now they were helping back. The warehouse was 5 times larger than the thrift shop. Rows of wide open space. Concrete floors. Tall ceilings. At first the size felt overwhelming. But volunteers from the neighborhood arrived almost immediately. Shelves were built. Clothing racks assembled. Furniture arranged into sections. Within 3 weeks, the warehouse transformed into something completely different. A massive thrift store filled with donated items. Clothes, books, tables, kitchen supplies, even bicycles. On the opening day, people lined up again. But this time the line wrapped around the entire building. Inside the warehouse, customers walked through aisles that seemed to stretch forever. Families pushed carts filled with items they could finally afford. Students searched through bookshelves. Workers found jackets and tools. And the cash register kept ringing. The store that once started with $73 in a small metal box had become the largest thrift shop in the city. But the growth of the store was only half the story, because the legal battle continued moving forward. The forensic investigation uncovered even more evidence. Hidden accounts, undisclosed transfers, corporate assets purchased with stolen funds. Every discovery weakened the corporation further. Investors began asking questions. Board members demanded answers. And the person who once controlled everything slowly lost that control. Several executives resigned. Financial regulators opened their own investigations. By the time the final court hearing approached, the corporation looked nothing like the confident empire it once was. Inside the warehouse store one evening, the accountant stood beside me near the entrance. Customers moved through the aisles carrying baskets of clothing and books. "You built something bigger than a business," he said. "It started as survival. And now," I looked across the busy store, "now it belongs to the community." The accountant smiled. "But tomorrow the court decides the rest." "Yes, because the final ruling would determine something very simple. Who owned the company that started this entire story? And whether the person who stole it would finally face the consequences." Later that night, after the store closed, I walked alone through the quiet aisles. The lights reflected softly across the concrete floor. Shelves filled with donated items stretched across the building. Each piece carried a story. Someone giving, someone receiving, someone starting again. The same idea that built the shop from the beginning. A second chance. But tomorrow the story would return to the courtroom one last time. And when that final decision arrived, it would not only change the future of the company, it would decide whether the truth could actually defeat power. The warehouse lights switched off one by one as I walked toward the exit. Outside, the night air felt calm. But somewhere across the city, the person who betrayed me was preparing for the final hearing. And tomorrow we would stand in the same courtroom again. Except this time the entire city would be watching. Because the story that started with laughter outside a tiny thrift shop had grown into something far larger. A fight between truth and power. And the final chapter was about to begin. The final hearing took place on a gray morning that felt unusually quiet. When I arrived at the courthouse, the steps outside were already crowded. Reporters, cameras, people from the neighborhood who had followed the story from the beginning. Some of them recognized me as I walked past. A few nodded. One woman raised a hand and said softly, "Good luck." Inside the building, the atmosphere felt heavier than before, because this hearing would not simply review evidence. It would decide everything: ownership, fraud, responsibility. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The room fell silent. My lawyer reviewed the final investigation report for the court. Months of forensic accounting. Thousands of documents examined. Every transfer traced. The results were simple. Corporate funds had been secretly moved into shell companies. Those companies then purchased assets used to build the corporation that replaced the original business. And the signatures used to authorize the restructuring that removed me from ownership were proven to be forged. The opposing legal team attempted their final defense. They argued technical details, procedural questions, but the evidence was overwhelming. For nearly 2 hours, the judge reviewed the final arguments. Then the courtroom fell completely silent. Because everyone knew the decision was coming, the judge spoke slowly. This court has reviewed extensive financial records, witness testimony, and forensic accounting analysis. The judge paused briefly. The evidence demonstrates that the corporate restructuring that removed the plaintiff from ownership was conducted using fraudulent documentation. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom, but the judge continued. The transfer of ownership is therefore declared invalid. Across the room, my former partner lowered their head slightly. The judge continued reading. The court orders the restoration of the original ownership structure of the company. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered quietly, "You have your company back." The words felt almost unreal, because the battle that destroyed everything had finally reversed itself. But the judge was not finished. Further investigation has confirmed the use of corporate funds in unauthorized financial transfers. The judge looked toward my former partner. The matter will be referred for criminal investigation. The courtroom erupted with murmurs. Reporters rushed to write notes. The judge raised a hand. Order. The room settled again. Then the gavel struck once. The hearing ended. Just like that. Years of betrayal collapsed in a single decision. Outside, the courthouse cameras surrounded the exit. Microphones reached forward as reporters asked questions all at once. Do you feel vindicated today? What happens to the company now? How does it feel to win? I paused for a moment before answering. Today is not about winning, I said. It is about the truth. The reporters continued shouting questions, but I stepped away from the cameras and walked down the courthouse steps. The accountant stood waiting near the sidewalk. Well, he asked. It is finished. He smiled slowly. I waited years to hear that. Across the street, a group of people from the neighborhood stood watching. When they heard the news, several of them began clapping. The sound spread through the crowd. The applause was not loud, but it felt genuine. Later that evening, I returned to the warehouse store, the largest thrift shop in the city. The building looked warm and bright under the evening lights. Inside, customers moved through the aisles like usual, searching through racks, talking quietly, finding small things that made their day easier. The store manager walked toward me. You should see the line outside earlier, they said. Busy day? Very. I smiled slightly, because the store had grown far beyond anything I imagined when I first opened that tiny shop. The place where people laughed. I walked slowly through the aisles, past the clothing racks, past the furniture section, past the shelves of books. Each step reminded me how the story started, with a small sign, a cheap brush, and people laughing on the sidewalk. Near the entrance, a young parent stood with a child trying on a winter coat. The child smiled when it fit. The same kind of moment I saw on the very first day the shop opened. Some things never change, and that is a good thing. I stepped outside for a moment. The evening air felt calm. The parking lot stretched across the front of the building, filled with cars. People walked toward the entrance carrying donation boxes. The same simple idea that built the shop from the beginning continued growing. Give what you can. Take what you need. Second chances. A reporter approached me near the door. One last question, they said. What would you say to the people who laughed when you first opened that thrift shop? I looked back at the building, the huge warehouse, the long line of customers, the bright lights glowing through the windows. Then I remembered that first morning, the cracked sidewalk, the cheap sign, the laughter. I smiled slightly. They were right about one thing, I said. What do you mean? I looked at the line of people waiting to enter. They said the shop would change the city. The reporter blinked. I thought they said it would fail. They did. I turned toward the entrance. But sometimes people laugh because they cannot imagine what happens next. I walked back inside the store. The bell above the door rang. The same small sound that started everything. And somewhere far behind me, the laughter that once filled that street had finally disappeared, replaced by something much stronger. The sound of people walking through the biggest thrift shop in the city, finding second chances, just like I did. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe, because the next story I am about to share is even more unbelievable. It starts with a simple garage sale and ends with a courtroom battle nobody saw coming.